By now we've all seen the photo of Lieutenant John Pike casually and viciously pepper spraying students at UC Davis. That image has become a symbol of brutal force employed against nonviolent protesters. But John Pike is not exceptional, and he is certainly not the only police officer guilty of using violence against peaceful citizens. In a series of coordinated attacks on Occupy protests across the country, including New York, Chicago, Berkeley, Oakland, and here in Los Angeles, police officers have repeatedly used force against peaceful protesters. At UC Davis, Lieutenant John Pike nonchalantly pepper sprayed one student after another. In Seattle, 84-year-old activist Dorley Rainey was also pepper sprayed. In Oakland, Iraq War veteran Scott Olson was shot by a police projectile and suffered brain damage. Activists of all ages and backgrounds have become victims of police brutality. Here in LA, more than 1,400 officers stormed out of City Hall to tear down the Occupy encampment, pushing, shoving, and beating anyone who got in their way. They hit people with batons, fired rubber bullets at protesters who had climbed trees, and beat a photographer in front of live news cameras. Nearly 300 people were arrested and held for hours in painful restraints without access to lawyers, medical attention, or even a bathroom. The LAPD's violent, dehumanizing behavior was praised by Mayor Villaraigosa, who called the raid perhaps one of the finest moments in the history of the Los Angeles Police Department, and a shining example of constitutional policing. He specifically praised the city and the LAPD for respecting the dignity of the protesters. While Mayor Villaraigosa may be proud of the LAPD response, the truth is that the way they behave demonstrates a complete lack of respect for the dignity and basic rights of the protesters. As many of us in this room know, the police treat citizens like violent criminals and dangerous threats, whether they have broken the law or not. The Occupy protesters have been treated disrespectfully and approached with force since the beginning of the movement, despite their nonviolent tactics. The vast majority of violence and destruction of property has been at the hands of the police. Yet city officials, police officers, and many media outlets continue to minimize the brutality of these assaults. Some officers describe the use of pepper spray, which is considered a weapon and it is illegal to possess in many countries, as a compliance technique. The officers who pepper sprayed protesters in New York, Seattle, Berkeley, and elsewhere were not acting against orders. These tactics are considered standard police procedure. They are not the actions of bad apples. This is the way police officers are trained to respond, with pepper spray, rubber bullets, and tear gas. Our constitutionally protected rights to free speech and assembly, as well as our human rights and human dignity, are disregarded because when we fight against the system that oppresses us, we are viewed as the enemy. The police do not serve the interests of the working class and have no concern for protecting our rights. The police protect the interests of the wealthy, as their actions show. The growing popularity of the Occupy movement presents a threat to the interests of the tiny, powerful ruling class. The police, who serve to enforce those interests, are being used to suppress dissent. The nationwide police raids are part of a coordinated effort by the ruling class to crush the growing Occupy movement. Protesters and journalists have been intimidated, threatened, beaten, and arrested in city after city. The Department of Homeland Security, which has coordinated closely in the past with the NYPD and LAPD, among others, participated in a conference call in November with the mayors of 18 cities across the United States, advising mayors on how to suppress the Occupy protests. This violent crackdown on the Occupy movement is bringing new attention to the violence and oppression that are constant features of capitalist society. The police have long used violence to oppress working class and minority communities, and they do so to protect the interests of the ruling class. The broad appeal of the Occupy movement brought police brutality to a new audience and exposed the ongoing struggle that poor and minority communities face every day. Human rights violations are commonplace, despite the popular perception that we live in the land of the free. The United States government promotes itself as the protector of human rights and democracy around the world, but the opposite is actually true. Our government's wars of imperialist aggression have taken countless lives. Thousands of civilians have been killed in Iraq and Afghanistan since the so-called War on Terror began, and U.S. and NATO-led interventions elsewhere bring the death toll even higher. At home, the U.S. imprisons more of its people than any other country in the world. We also have the highest youth incarceration rate. The private prison industry is very profitable, bringing in around $4 billion a year. Although crime rates have been declining since the 1990s, incarceration rates have steadily increased. At the end of 2010, America's prison population was more than 2.4 million. 7 million more are under correctional supervision, and over 13 million people pass through the jail and prison system annually. Around 1/3 of inmates were unemployed before they were in prison, and another 1/3 had incomes less than $5,000. People of color are particularly vulnerable to the for-profit prison system and account for a disproportionate number of prisoners. The number of women in prison has tripled over the last decade, and at least 40% of female prisoners have young children. The private prison industry and the racist judicial system deprives many of the most basic human rights, including the right to life. Police violence is a regular occurrence in the United States. All too often we see reports of innocent people beaten, brutalized, and killed by corrupt police departments. Yet police budgets continue to grow, even as cuts to education, healthcare, and housing continue. Police departments in many major cities repeatedly face complaints and lawsuits for their misconduct. The NYPD has paid $964 million, almost $1 billion, to resolve claims against its officers over the last 10 years. The LAPD is particularly notorious for its well-documented history of racism, corruption, and brutality, as well as pioneering the use of paramilitary police units. The LAPD's response to the MacArthur Park May Day rally in 2007 resulted in $13 million in settlements, and that's just one example. The everyday oppression and humiliation of the working class is a painful reality of the capitalist system. This system allows a tiny percentage to grow richer and richer at the expense of the vast majority of workers who create all the wealth, the other 99%. That tiny ruling class created the worst economic crisis our nation has seen since the Great Depression. Working people have been kicked out of their homes, lost their jobs, and seen vital services cut again and again. People are suffering daily as a result of this crisis. And the crisis is not the result of scarcity, but of overproduction. There are too many houses and too few buyers to sell them at a profit, so families are kicked out onto the street by greedy bankers. The Occupy movement is a direct response to this crisis, and the ruling class is trying to stop it before it spreads by using violence and intimidation. But working people have had enough. We're struggling too hard just to survive. We face grinding poverty and a lack of jobs. We're denied health care and education. A tiny percentage continues to grow richer and richer off the fruits of our labor, and we are told we must pay for the economic crisis they created. The Occupy movement shows that working people in the United States are willing to stand up and fight. The ruling class has responded with a brutal show of force in an attempt to crush this growing movement, but the people's will to struggle is only growing stronger. Only a government that truly serves the will of the people can eliminate this constant brutality and oppression. We will continue to organize and fight back against this vicious, violent system.